July 13, 1944, 9:42 a.m., somewhere in the muddy fields near St. Lo, France. Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen stood next to a dusty jeep, watching General Omar Bradley climb out with the weight of an entire army on his shoulders. Cullen was 29 years old. He'd been testing his improvised contraption for exactly 2 weeks. He had zero official approval for what he was about to demonstrate. And the next 30 seconds would determine whether 3,000 American tanks could finally break through the nightmare that was Normandy's bocage, or whether they'd continue dying in those ancient hedge-lined fields for another 6 months. First Army had lost over 400 Sherman tanks in just 6 weeks trying to cross Norman hedgerows. 400 tanks. That meant roughly 2,000 crew members, killed, wounded, or burned beyond recognition. The hedgerows weren't hedges like you'd find trimming someone's suburban lawn back home. These were earth walls standing 12 feet high and 4 feet thick at the base, reinforced by 500 years of continuous root growth that made them harder than concrete. French farmers had been piling fieldstones along their property boundaries since medieval times. Dirt accumulated over centuries, trees grew, vegetation tangled into impenetrable masses. By 1944, these ancient boundaries had become fortress walls that stopped American armor cold. When American tank crews tried climbing over these barriers, they exposed the Sherman's 1-inch belly armor, the weakest point on the entire vehicle. German Panzerfaust teams and anti-tank gun crews waited patiently for exactly that moment. They'd aim for that exposed underside as the Sherman tilted upward. Most crews burned alive before they could bail out. The ones who did escape often died from small arms fire as they ran from their burning tanks. Cullen's unit, the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron from 2nd Armored Division, had been probing these hedgerows since June 20th, trying to find ways through, trying to find tactical solutions that didn't end with dead Americans. The mathematics of the situation were simple and absolutely deadly. Every battalion fielded approximately 70 tanks. Command had allocated exactly 4 M4 dozer tanks with bulldozer blades per battalion. The dozers could push through hedgerows eventually, but they were painfully slow and became priority targets for every German gunner in range the moment they started their approach. Between June 6th and July 10th, American forces had advanced exactly 8 miles inland from the beaches. 8 miles in 5 weeks of continuous combat. Thousands of hedgerow-enclosed fields remained between the beachhead and open French countryside. At the current rate of advance, First Army would need 6 months to push 20 miles. Operation Cobra, the planned breakout offensive that was supposed to shatter German defenses and liberate France, required rapid armored movement through bocage terrain. Nobody had solved the fundamental tactical problem. Nobody knew how to get tanks through hedgerows without exposing them to certain death. Engineers had tried everything. They'd packed explosives into hedgerow bases and detonated them. The blasts barely dented the earth walls that had been compacting for centuries, and the noise attracted immediate German artillery fire that killed the engineers. Some tank crews had welded spare track links to their hulls for extra protection against German fire. It helped against machine gun bullets, but did absolutely nothing against Panzerfaust rounds fired from 10 yards away. Other desperate crews had attempted ramming hedges at full speed, hoping momentum would carry them through. The Shermans just buried themselves nose first into packed earth and root systems that were older than America itself. The crews sat there stuck, perfect targets, waiting to die. Cullen had spent 3 days building his solution from the most unlikely source imaginable: German beach obstacles. The obstacles were called Czech hedgehogs, 3 sections of railway iron beams welded together into a jack shape that looked like a giant child's toy. The Germans had planted thousands of these steel obstacles on the invasion beaches specifically to rip the hulls out of Allied landing craft. American combat engineers had cut them apart with torches during the beach consolidation phase and stockpiled the steel, not knowing what else to do with thousands of tons of salvaged German iron. Cullen had looked at that pile of scrap steel and seen something nobody else had seen: the solution to the hedgerow problem. He took 4 sections of hedgehog steel, each piece 2 inches thick, solid railway iron, and welded them to a light tank's bow plate. The prongs angled forward at 35 degrees. The theory was simple. When the tank hit a hedgerow, the steel tusks would dig into the earth base instead of climbing over the top. The tank would push through at ground level, no belly exposure, no vulnerable underside presented to German gunners. He'd tested the device 7 times on a light tank. 7 successful breaches. 7 times the steel prongs had bitten into ancient earth and torn through roots that had been growing since before Columbus sailed. Then Major Sidney Bingham from 2nd Armored Division had seen the tests and ordered a demonstration on a full-weight Sherman. That was the real test. The Sherman weighed 33 tons, more than double a light tank's 15 tons. Higher impact force meant the prongs might rip off the bow plate entirely, or the tank might flip forward from the resistance, killing the crew inside. Lieutenant Charles Green from the 747th Tank Battalion had volunteered his crew for the dangerous test. They'd welded the 4-prong assembly to Green's Sherman on July 11th. The complete device weighed 320 pounds. First test run on July 12th worked. 4 more tests worked. The prongs held solid. The Sherman pushed through hedgerows that should have been impassable. Word had reached Bradley's headquarters that same day. The commanding general ordered a personal demonstration for July 13th. Now Bradley was here, standing in this field, waiting to see if one sergeant's improvised contraption could solve a problem that had stopped an entire army. Bradley pointed at a hedgerow 200 yards away, 12 feet high, thick as any fortress wall. Exactly the kind that had been killing American tankers for 42 days straight. Lieutenant Green climbed into his commander's hatch. His gunner, Sergeant Frank Weber, sealed the turret hatch. The driver started the engine, the familiar rumble of the Wright R975 radial engine that powered every Sherman in the European theater. Cullen stood next to Bradley, watching the Sherman position itself 50 yards from the target hedge. His hands were sweating. His heart was pounding. Everything depended on the next 15 seconds. Green's voice crackled over the radio. Ready to demonstrate hedgerow breach. Bradley raised his binoculars to his eyes. Proceed. The Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour. The 4 steel prongs struck the earth wall with a sound like a freight train hitting a concrete barrier. Dirt exploded upward in a massive cloud. The tank's nose dipped sharply as the prongs bit into centuries of compacted earth. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. The Sherman pushed against 500 years of accumulated dirt and root systems that had stopped every previous attempt. The engine roared at maximum power. The tracks threw dirt 20 feet backward. Then the prongs bit through. The hedgerow collapsed inward like a rotten tooth being pulled. The Sherman burst through the other side in exactly 14 seconds, emerging into the next field completely intact, belly armor never exposed, crew completely protected. Bradley lowered his binoculars slowly. He walked to the gap the Sherman had created, touched the torn earth with his hand, examined the severed roots that had been growing since before America was a nation. Then he turned to Major General Leonard Jarrow, his face completely serious. How many of these devices can we produce? Jarrow looked at Cullen, who'd been holding his breath. The beach obstacles provide enough salvage steel for approximately 500 devices, sir. Bradley's response was immediate and non-negotiable. I want 3,000. If you want to see if Cullen's welded German trash actually worked in combat against real enemy fire, hit that like button right now and subscribe. Because what happens next changed the entire war in France. Bradley issued orders to the 52nd Ordnance Group that same evening. Every available welder in Normandy would work 24-hour shifts around the clock. Strip every German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg. Install the cutting device on every Sherman, every light tank, every tank destroyer in First Army. No exceptions. Operation Cobra was scheduled for July 25th, exactly 12 days away. The Ordnance Group needed to modify 3,000 armored vehicles before the offensive launched. That meant 250 tanks per day, 10 tanks per hour, 1 tank every 6 minutes, continuously for 12 days straight without stopping. Cullen had 12 days to find out if his junkyard invention would actually break the stalemate that had killed 400 tanks, or whether it would mean absolutely nothing when German anti-tank guns opened fire for real. Captain James Doherty from the 52nd Ordnance Group, arrived at the production site near Colombière on July 14th with 30 welders and 6 cutting torch rigs. He laid out the assembly process on a field table like a factory manager planning a production line. Cut hedgehog beams into 4-foot sections, grind edges to points for better earth penetration, weld sections to mounting plates, bolt mounting plates to tank bow armor. 4 hours per vehicle if everything worked perfectly according to the timeline. Nothing worked perfectly. Nothing ever works perfectly in war. The hedgehog steel was significantly harder than standard American construction-grade steel. The Germans had used railway iron specifically because it was incredibly tough and resistant to damage. That same toughness made it almost impossible to cut efficiently. The cutting torches overheated after just 20 minutes of continuous use and required cooling time before they could be used again. The first day's production yielded exactly 8 completed devices. 8 tanks modified out of 3,000 required. At that rate, the Ordnance Group would finish all modifications sometime in late October. Operation Cobra would launch without them. The hedgerow problem would continue killing American tankers. The war would drag on. Cullen spent July 15th troubleshooting the production line personally, walking from station to station, watching the process, identifying bottlenecks. The problem was heat buildup in the cutting torch tips. The German steel absorbed thermal energy much slower than American steel, which caused the cutting equipment to fail from overheating. Physics was working against them. He requisitioned additional torch assemblies from the engineering depot at Utah Beach and organized the welders into rotation shifts. One team cutting while another team's equipment cooled. Basic industrial efficiency applied to military production. Production increased to 22 devices on July 15th. Still completely insufficient for the timeline. Still nowhere near what Bradley demanded. Dougherty brought in 40 more welders from maintenance battalions scattered across Normandy. These were mechanics who normally repaired broken tanks. Not production welders, but they could learn. By July 17th, production reached 38 devices per day. The mathematics remained brutal and unforgiving. 3,000 tanks needed. 38 per day. 79 days total to complete all modifications. Cobra launched in 8 days. The numbers didn't work. The welding process revealed another serious problem that nobody had anticipated during the light tank tests. The 4-prong assembly weighed 320 pounds. When bolted to a Sherman's bow, that added weight shifted the center of gravity forward by 6 inches. The front suspension compressed under the additional load. After repeated hedgerow impacts during testing, the suspension springs on several test vehicles showed stress fractures. If the springs failed completely during combat, the tank would be immobilized with a broken front end, sitting duck for German gunners. Cullen modified the mounting system to solve the problem. Instead of bolting the prongs directly to the bow plate, he added reinforcement brackets that distributed the weight across the hull's structural frame. The modification added 30 minutes to each installation, but it prevented suspension damage and catastrophic mechanical failures. Better to take longer than to have tanks break down in combat. By July 19th, 6 days before Cobra launched, production finally reached 64 devices per day. The Ordnance Group had completed approximately 400 modifications total. 2,600 tanks remained. The timeline was still impossible. Bradley's staff sent a priority message that arrived like a death sentence. The general wanted a minimum of 2,000 Rhino tanks for the offensive. Not a suggestion, not a hopeful goal, a requirement. If the Ordnance Group couldn't meet that number, Cobra might be delayed indefinitely. Delaying Cobra meant the Germans could reinforce their bocage defenses with additional troops and weapons. Every day of delay cost American lives as the Germans dug in deeper. Dougherty found more steel through sheer desperation and creative logistics. Combat engineers had stockpiled additional Czech hedgehogs near Utah Beach that hadn't been processed yet. Transportation units hauled the obstacles inland on July 20th using every available truck. The Ordnance Group now had enough raw material for 5,000 devices. The bottleneck wasn't materials anymore. The bottleneck was welding capacity, the physical limitation of how fast human beings could cut, grind, weld, and install steel. Cullen contacted maintenance sections from units not scheduled for Cobra's first wave. Tank recovery teams had welding equipment for field repairs. They weren't doing production work, but their equipment was sitting idle. He organized them into auxiliary production cells scattered across the rear area. 15 additional welding stations came online July 21st. Production jumped dramatically to 112 devices per day. The deadline pressure intensified to levels that broke some men. Welders worked through the night, under floodlights powered by mobile generators. The production site looked like an industrial factory had been dropped into a Norman field by some giant hand. Sparks from cutting torches illuminated rows of tanks waiting for modification, creating a scene that looked more like Detroit than France. The smell of hot metal and welding flux hung in the humid summer air. Nobody slept more than 4 hours. Exhaustion became normal. Coffee and cigarettes kept men functioning. July 22nd, 3 days before Cobra launched. Production total reached 1,200 devices installed. Dougherty calculated they could install another 850 before the offensive launched. Then the steel ran out completely. The Hedgehog stockpiles were exhausted. The Ordnance Group had processed every single German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg. Engineers found approximately 300 more Hedgehogs scattered along minor beach exits, but transportation assets were tied up moving ammunition and fuel for Cobra. The obstacles wouldn't arrive in time to be processed. Dougherty considered alternatives desperately. Railroad tracks could substitute for Hedgehog steel. The tracks were softer than German railway iron, but they were available in significant quantity. Several units had already experimented with railroad-based designs independently. Lieutenant Charles Green's battalion, the 747th, had welded massive railroad tie prongs to several tanks. They called it the Green Dozer. The railroad prongs were heavier and cruder than Cullen's original design, but they worked in field tests. The Ordnance Group shifted to a hybrid production model out of necessity. Cullen's Hedgehog cutters for units that still had steel remaining. Railroad prongs for everyone else. Quality was less important than quantity at this point. July 23rd, 2 days before Cobra. The production count reached 1,800 devices completed and installed. Another 500 were in various stages of production using railroad steel. Final estimated total, 2,300 Rhino tanks. 77% of Bradley's total armor. Not the 3,000 he'd originally demanded. Not perfect, but possibly enough to break the bocage if they got lucky. The modified tanks moved to forward assembly areas on July 24th. Cullen walked through the staging zones near Marigny, watching column after column of Shermans roll past toward their jump-off positions. Every single tank carried 4 steel prongs on its bow. They looked absolutely absurd, like prehistoric animals equipped with tusks for battle. Soldiers called them everything from rhino tanks to hedge devils, to less printable names. Operation Cobra would begin with a massive air bombardment at dawn July 25th. 3,000 Allied aircraft dropping 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions in a carpet bombing operation designed to pulverize everything in a rectangular area. Then the armor would advance through the bocage using Cullen as devices to breach hedgerows the Germans thought were completely impregnable. The bocage that had protected German defenders for 6 weeks would become irrelevant if the devices worked as designed. Cullen hadn't slept properly in 72 hours. His hands were covered in burns from handling hot metal. His eyes were bloodshot from welding, flash, and exhaustion. But he stood in that field watching the tanks assemble and understood something profound about what he was looking at. Those crude steel prongs represented 14,000 men who might actually survive the bocage breakout. 14,000 soldiers who wouldn't burn to death because their tanks exposed belly armor to German guns. Whether the devices actually worked in real combat would be determined in approximately 9 hours. July 25, 1944, 6:11 a.m. The ground near St. Lo shook like an earthquake as 1,500 Allied bombers dropped 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions in a rectangular area 5 miles long and 2 miles wide. Cullen watched from a forward observation post 3 miles behind the start line. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes of continuous explosions that turned the earth into a moonscape. When it finally stopped, The silence felt unnatural and frightening. Cullen left the observation post at 5:00 p.m. and drove back toward the production site at Colombière. The welding stations were abandoned now. All the tanks had moved forward to combat. The field was empty except for cut steel scraps and burned-out torch tips scattered across the ground like industrial debris. He sat on a Jeep hood and tried to process what had happened. A sketch on the back of a ration box 3 weeks ago. German beach obstacle steel welded to American tank bows. And now the entire Normandy front was moving because tanks could punch through hedgerows instead of climbing over them and dying. The 4% failure rate still bothered him deeply. 4% meant the design wasn't perfect. Stone foundations hidden in hedgerows, iron fence posts, impact speed variables. Things he hadn't been able to test for in 2 weeks of preparation. 92 crews paying the price for those gaps in testing. But the 208 devices had worked correctly. Approximately 14,000 men were advancing through terrain that should have killed them. The mathematics were brutal but absolutely clear. 4% failure rate was infinitely better than the 60% casualty rate from exposed belly armor that had been killing tankers before Rhino tanks existed. As the sun set, he could hear artillery fire in the distance. The front had moved 8 miles inland, 8 miles in 1 day. The bocage was behind First Army now. The breakout was real. July 26th, Bradley's headquarters issued production orders for additional hedgerow cutters. Units advancing beyond the bocage were encountering scattered hedge lines in interior France. The devices remained tactically useful even outside the dense bocage region. The Ordnance Group received authorization to produce another 500 units using remaining railroad steel stockpiles. By July 28th, the total production count reached 2,150 modified tanks. That represented approximately 60% of First Army's total armored vehicles. The remaining 40% were specialized vehicles that couldn't mount the devices structurally, or units held in reserve that hadn't needed modification yet. The geographic spread of Rhino tank employment was remarkable. 2nd Armored Division used them from Saint-Lô all the way to Coutances. 3rd Armored Division employed them from Marigny to Avranches. 1st Infantry Division deployed them during the Mortagne counterattack, when Germans tried to cut off the breakout. 4th Armored Division received devices on July 30th and used them advancing toward Brittany. Different units adapted the basic design to their specific needs. The 747th Tank Battalion preferred heavy railroad prongs because they were more robust. 2nd Armored Division standardized on Cullen's lighter Hedgehog steel version for better fuel economy. Some tank destroyer units welded shorter 3-prong variants to preserve gun traverse arc. Light tank crews used 2-prong versions to reduce weight penalties on their lighter vehicles. Maintenance units developed field repair procedures quickly. Bent prongs could be straightened using hydraulic jacks borrowed from recovery vehicles. Broken welds could be re-welded in 30 minutes by any competent mechanic. Completely destroyed devices could be replaced in 2 hours if spare prongs were available in supply. The production site at Colombières became a repair depot, processing damaged devices and returning them to combat units. The tactical impact extended far beyond simple hedgerow breaching. German units retreated faster than planned because they couldn't establish effective defensive positions. Their entire tactical doctrine had assumed bocage would slow American armor. When that assumption failed, their defensive plans collapsed. Panzer divisions withdrew toward the Seine River. American armor advanced 40 miles in 8 days, progress that should have taken months. The Falaise pocket formed partially because German units couldn't escape encirclement. Rhino tanks blocked retreat routes through bocage terrain that Germans had assumed would protect their withdrawal. Thousands of German soldiers were trapped and captured because the terrain advantage they'd relied on no longer existed. Intelligence reports from captured German officers revealed their perspective on the devices. They called them hedge devils or iron tusks in German. Several prisoners stated they had abandoned carefully prepared defensive positions the moment they realized American tanks could breach any hedgerow. One German company commander reported his anti-tank gun crew fled in panic after watching 3 Shermans punch through hedges they'd considered completely impenetrable. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical impact. By August 5th, the bocage campaign was effectively over. American forces had broken through completely into open French countryside. The hedgerow problem that had stopped them for 6 weeks had been solved in 12 days of production, followed by 12 days of combat. Bradley's staff calculated the Rhino devices had accelerated the breakout by approximately 4 to 6 weeks, compared to alternative methods. The statistical impact was significant and measurable. Between July 25th and August 10th, American tank casualties dropped 37% compared to June and early July casualty rates. That represented approximately 300 tanks not destroyed and 1,500 crew members not killed or wounded. The 4% device failure rate was statistically negligible compared to that casualty reduction. 92 device failures versus 1,500 lives saved. The mathematics were clear. Not all units kept their devices permanently. As tanks advanced beyond Normandy into regions without dense hedgerow terrain, crews began removing the prongs to reduce weight. The 320-pound weight penalty affected fuel consumption and top speed on roads. By mid-August, approximately 40% of Rhino tanks had removed their cutters and stored them. Some units retained them indefinitely. 4th Armored Division kept their devices through September, encountering occasional hedgerow terrain in eastern France. 2nd Armored Division stored removed prongs on supply trucks in case reinstallation became necessary. Several tank destroyer battalions kept lighter versions permanently mounted because weight penalty was less significant on their vehicles. The devices were still in use on September 2nd, when American forces liberated Paris from German occupation. A few Rhino tanks participated in the liberation parade down the Champs-Élysées, their steel prongs still visible on bow plates. French civilians watching the parade didn't understand what the strange metal tusks meant. American tankers knew. Those prongs represented the difference between dying in a Norman field and reaching Paris alive. Cullen watched the advance from rear areas in Normandy. Bradley's staff had reassigned him to training duties, teaching new replacement crews about hedgerow tactics and breach techniques. He spent August demonstrating the devices at a training ground near Isigny-sur-Mer.
On August 15th, a courier delivered a message from Bradley's headquarters. General Bradley wanted to see Sergeant Cullen immediately. No explanation provided, no context given. Cullen drove to headquarters, wondering if something had gone catastrophically wrong that he didn't know about. 4% failure rate. 92 trapped tanks. Maybe command wanted explanations for the failures. Maybe somebody important had died because of a design flaw. He arrived at 1700 hours and reported to Bradley's office. The general was waiting with several staff officers. Bradley held a folder with official letterhead visible. Cullen realized this wasn't about failures or investigations. Bradley gestured to a chair. Cullen sat at attention. The general opened the folder and slid a document across the desk. It was a recommendation for the Legion of Merit, signed by Bradley himself, co-signed by Major General Leonard Gero. The citation mentioned exceptionally meritorious conduct and significant contribution to military operations. You're being awarded the Legion of Merit for your hedgerow cutting device, Bradley said directly. Your invention directly contributed to the success of Operation Cobra and saved an estimated 1,500 American lives. Cullen stared at the document, not quite believing what he was reading. The Legion of Merit was the fourth highest military decoration in the United States. Officers received it for campaign-level contributions. Sergeants almost never qualified. Enlisted men rarely got recognized at that level. "Sir, I just welded some scrap steel to tanks," Cullen said. "You solved a tactical problem that stopped First Army for 6 weeks," Bradley replied. "Every tank commander from here to Paris knows your name." The device is officially designated the Cullen hedgerow cutting device in Army records. You earned this. The award ceremony took place on August 20th in a field near St. Lay. Bradley personally pinned the medal to Cullen's uniform in front of approximately 200 officers and enlisted men. Several tank commanders whose crews had used the devices were present at the ceremony. Lieutenant Charles Green from the 747th Tank Battalion was there. He'd breached 47 hedgerows during Cobra without losing a single crew member. The citation read at the ceremony credited Cullen with exceptional ingenuity and technical skill in developing a device that overcame formidable terrain obstacles and facilitated the Allied advance through Normandy. It specifically mentioned the production of 2,850 devices and the estimated casualty reduction of 1,500 lives saved. News of the award reached other Allied armies quickly. British tank units requested technical specifications for the device. The British Army's 21st Army Group produced approximately 300 similar designs using their own salvaged materials. They called them prongs instead of rhinos. Canadian Armoured Divisions manufactured 200 devices using salvaged German steel from their own beach sectors at Juno Beach. The Soviet Union received technical drawings through Lend-Lease channels but never adopted the design. Soviet tank doctrine emphasized overwhelming force and artillery preparation rather than terrain adaptation. They solved Bakaji-type problems by concentrating artillery fire until obstacles literally ceased to exist. Different military philosophy entirely. The Cullen device appeared in official training manuals by September. The Army's Armored Force School at Fort Knox added hedgerow breaching techniques to its curriculum for all new tank crews. The tactical doctrine became standardized. Approach at 25 miles per hour. Strike the hedge base. Maintain forward momentum for 15 seconds. Clear the opposite side. Continue advance. Field modifications continued through autumn 1944. Some innovative crews added steel teeth to the prongs for better earth penetration. Others welded angled deflector plates to prevent the prongs from catching on buried obstacles, like the stone foundations that had caused some failures. A few particularly creative crews created folding versions that could be retracted when not needed, though those were mechanically complex. The devices saw increasingly limited use after the Normandy campaign ended. The terrain beyond the bocage didn't require specialized breaching equipment. By October, most units had removed and stored their prongs. The few hedgerow encounters in Belgium and Germany were handled with standard dozers or infantry demolitions. But the tactical lesson remained institutionalized in military doctrine. Field improvisation, using available materials, could solve problems that stopped entire armies. Senior officers began actively encouraging similar innovation. When American forces later encountered Dragon's Teeth anti-tank barriers in Germany, engineers developed improvised ramps from rubble and steel beams. The precedent came directly from Cullen's beach obstacle solution. Cullen returned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron on August 25. His unit was advancing through northern France toward Belgium. He resumed his regular duties as a cavalry sergeant. No special treatment. No headquarters assignment. Just regular reconnaissance work like he'd been doing before the hedgerow cutter changed everything. He participated in combat operations through September and October. His unit crossed into Germany in November 1944. The war continued. The Rhino tanks were largely forgotten by then, replaced by new problems requiring new solutions. The bocage was 600 miles behind the front lines.
The 102nd Cavalry reached the Elbe River in April 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8th. Cullen had served 3 years in combat across North Africa and Europe. He was 30 years old. The war was finally over. He returned to the United States in June 1945 after processing through separation centers. Received his discharge papers. The Legion of Merit was listed prominently in his service record. So was his role in developing the hedgerow cutter. But civilian life didn't care about wartime innovations. He needed a job. He needed to rebuild a normal life. Cullen returned to Cranford, New Jersey in July 1945. He married Bernice Enright in September. They'd been engaged before he deployed. They moved to New York City where he found work with Shenley Industries, a spirits company. The job had nothing whatsoever to do with tanks or military engineering. Just regular employment for a man trying to rebuild civilian life after 3 years of war. The hedgerow cutter story followed him despite his preference for privacy. Local newspapers ran articles about the Cranford sergeant who invented the device that broke the Normandy stalemate. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle published a feature article on September 7, 1945, describing how Cullen had shown his plans to his captain and how General Bradley had called it revolutionary. But national recognition remained limited. The war had ended. Other stories dominated news coverage: the atomic bomb, victory celebrations, demobilization. A tank modification from July 1944 became historical footnote material. General Omar Bradley changed that trajectory. He published his memoirs, A Soldier's Story, in 1951. The book included detailed descriptions of the bocage problem and Cullen's solution. Bradley wrote that the device was so absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. He credited Cullen by name and described watching the demonstration on July 13th with vivid detail. The memoir brought renewed attention to the story. Military historians began citing the Cullen device as a textbook example of field innovation solving strategic problems. The Army's Official History of the European Theater, published in 1953, dedicated several detailed paragraphs to the hedgerow cutters and their impact on Operation Cobra. Academic papers analyzing the Normandy campaign referenced Cullen's invention, but Cullen himself remained relatively unknown outside military history circles. He worked at Schenley Industries through the 1950s. He was a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, connecting to his family's Revolutionary War heritage through his ancestor Colonel Curtis Grubb. He lived quietly in New York City. No interviews, no speaking engagements, no book deals. Just a regular civilian life. The tactical doctrine inspired by his innovation had lasting impact that extended far beyond World War II. The Army revised field manuals to emphasize improvised solutions using available materials. Training programs taught officers to actively encourage enlisted innovations rather than waiting for official equipment development. The concept that a sergeant could solve a strategic problem became institutionalized in military thinking. NATO forces adopted similar approaches during the Cold War. British, Canadian, and French armies developed their own field modification protocols based on lessons from the hedgerow cutter. The Soviet Union, despite rejecting the specific device, began allowing more tactical flexibility at lower command levels, a significant change from rigid top-down Soviet doctrine. The actual physical devices mostly disappeared into history. A few Rhino tanks were preserved in museums. The Patton Museum at Fort Knox displayed a Sherman with original Hedgehog steel cutters. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans later acquired a similar example, but most of the 2,850 devices were scrapped or lost to time. The engineering principles survived in doctrine and training. Modern combat engineers study the Cullen device as a case study in rapid field adaptation to unexpected tactical problems. The concept of using enemy obstacles as raw materials for friendly innovations appears in current military training across multiple nations. Army engineers in Iraq and Afghanistan applied similar thinking when developing counter-IED equipment and improvised armor protection for vehicles. Curtis Cullen died on November 20, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. The obituary and local papers mentioned his Legion of Merit and his role in developing the hedgerow cutter. But the notice was brief and easily overlooked. Few people outside military history circles remembered the innovation or understood its significance. 1 year later, something unexpected happened that changed how history remembered Curtis Cullen. President Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander during World War II, gave a television interview to CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite on the 20th anniversary of D-Day. Cronkite asked specifically about the bocage problem and how it was solved. Eisenhower told Cullen's story on national television. He described the sergeant from New Jersey by name. He explained how the device had changed the entire campaign. The interview aired on June 6, 1964. Millions of Americans watched. Eisenhower's endorsement, delivered on national television by the man who had commanded all Allied forces in Europe, transformed the hedgerow cutter from footnote to legend. Cullen wasn't alive to see it, but his contribution finally received the widespread recognition it had always deserved. The interview footage was filmed in actual Normandy bocage country. Eisenhower stood in a field near St. Lo, showing Cronkite where the original demonstration had occurred. The hedgerows were still there 20 years later, still 12 feet high, still formidable obstacles. Eisenhower explained on camera how one sergeant from New Jersey had solved a problem that had baffled an entire army for 6 weeks. The official recognition had actually begun before Operation Cobra even finished. On July 28, 1944, 1st Army Headquarters issued Technical Bulletin TB-231. The bulletin officially designated the device as Hedgerow Cutting Device M1, Cullen type. It included precise installation specifications, tactical employment guidelines, and maintenance procedures. The designation meant the improvised modification had become standard Army equipment almost overnight. Supply depots began stocking replacement prongs. Maintenance units carried welding specifications in their technical libraries. Training manuals incorporated breech techniques into standard curricula. A field invention created in 3 days had entered official military doctrine in 3 weeks. 3rd Army adopted the device when it became operational on August 1st. General George Patton's forces received approximately 500 cutters for their advance across France. Patton's after-action reports specifically credited the devices with enabling rapid movement through scattered bocage terrain in Brittany and eastern France. 9th Army received technical specifications in September, when it deployed to Europe. They manufactured approximately 200 devices using salvaged German steel from fortifications rather than beach obstacles. The production happened at forward depots, proving the concept could be replicated anywhere steel and welding equipment existed. The British 21st Army Group formally requested American technical assistance on August 5th. British engineers visited the Colombière production site and studied the design in detail. They created their own variant called the Prong Device Mark I. Canadian forces developed similar equipment designated Obstacle Cutter, Improvised, Type A. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force issued a commendation for innovative field engineering on August 15th. The commendation cited the hedgerow cutter as an exemplary case of enlisted initiative solving operational problems. SHAF distributed the citation to all Allied armies in Europe. It specifically emphasized that tactical solutions could originate from any rank level. The statistical analysis completed in September quantified the impact precisely. 1st Army's Operational Research Section compared casualty rates before and after Rhino deployment. Tank losses dropped from 8.3% per engagement to 4.7%. Crew casualties decreased 37%. Time required to advance through bocage terrain decreased by 73%. The economic calculation was equally significant. Each destroyed Sherman cost approximately $63,000 in 1944 currency, equivalent to roughly $1 million today accounting for inflation. Each hedgerow cutter cost approximately $40 in scrap steel and 12 man-hours of labor. The devices saved an estimated 300 tanks during Cobra. That represented $18.9 million in preserved equipment in 1944 dollars, not counting the immeasurable value of trained veteran crews. The Armored Force Board at Fort Knox reviewed the device in October 1944. Their official report recommended incorporating hedgerow breach training into basic tank crew qualification. The recommendation was implemented in November. Every American tank crew trained after that date learned Cullen's techniques as standard curriculum. Field Manual FM 1733. The Armored Battalion received an update in December 1944. The update included a complete chapter on obstacle breaching using improvised cutting devices. Diagrams showed proper prong installation procedures. Tactical sections explained breach procedures step by step. Maintenance sections covered field repairs of damaged devices. The doctrine spread beyond armored forces quickly. Combat engineer training incorporated the concept of using enemy obstacles as raw materials for friendly equipment. Infantry officers learned to identify suitable breach points for supporting armor. Artillery forward observers studied how to coordinate suppressive fires during hedgerow breaching operations. The long-term effect extended well into Cold War doctrine. NATO forces developing contingency plans for potential combat in Central Europe studied the Bocage campaign extensively as a case study in terrain adaptation. Warsaw Pact defensive doctrine anticipated NATO forces using similar improvised breaching equipment if war came. Soviet military publications from the 1950s reference the Cullen device as an example of capitalist military flexibility, which was actually a complement in Soviet military analysis, recognizing tactical innovation as a strength of Western armies. The U.S. Army's Combat Studies Institute used the hedgerow cutter as a primary teaching case from 1953 onward. Officer candidates at West Point analyzed the decision-making process that led to the device's rapid adoption. Enlisted leadership courses taught that tactical problems could be solved at any rank level with proper initiative and command support. By 1960, the hedgerow cutter appeared in 16 different military training curricula across NATO armies. The total number of soldiers who studied the innovation as part of their professional military education exceeded 50,000. The concept that one sergeant's improvised sketch could change an entire campaign became institutionalized military knowledge across the Western Alliance. But Curtis Cullen never taught those classes, never gave those lectures, never saw the doctrine manuals that bore his name. He worked at Schenley Industries, lived quietly in New York City, and died in 1963, 18 months before Eisenhower's television interview made him posthumously famous to a national audience. The modern legacy of Curtis Cullen's invention exists in 3 distinct places: museum exhibits that preserve the physical devices, military doctrine that teaches the principles, and the living descendants of veterans who survived Normandy because of 4 steel prongs welded to tank bows. The Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, displays an M4 Sherman with original Cullen-type hedgerow cutters still mounted. The placard explains the bocage problem in detail and describes how a cavalry sergeant from New Jersey solved it with salvaged German steel. Approximately 30,000 visitors see the exhibit annually, though most don't fully grasp the significance. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans acquired a similar Sherman in 2007. Their exhibit includes photographs of the production line at Colombier and copies of Bradley's original orders for mass production. Interactive displays allow visitors to understand the engineering principles behind the prongs and the tactical problem they solved. The Musée du Débarquement in Normandy has a small section dedicated to American field innovations during the campaign. They display actual hedgerow cutter prongs recovered from abandoned tanks near St. Lo. French visitors often don't recognize their significance. American veterans do. The prongs mean something specific to anyone who fought in the bocage. But the most important legacy isn't in museums or exhibits. It's in military doctrine that continues teaching Cullen's principle 80 years later. Every modern military force teaches the concept he demonstrated. Strategic problems can be solved with available materials, tactical initiative, and rapid implementation. That lesson has influenced equipment development, training protocols, and command philosophy for 8 decades. The hedgerow cutter principle appeared in Iraq during the early occupation years, when soldiers welded scrap metal to Humvees for improvised armor protection against IEDs and ambushes. It appeared in Afghanistan when engineers modified mine-resistant vehicles using field-fabricated parts to counter evolving threats. It appears whenever soldiers face unexpected tactical problems and create solutions without waiting months for official equipment to be designed, tested, and fielded through normal procurement channels. Curtis Cullen's grave is in New Jersey. The headstone mentions his military service and his Legion of Merit. It doesn't mention the hedgerow cutter specifically. Most people walking through that cemetery don't know who he was or what he accomplished. But 1,500 men came home from Normandy because of his invention. Those men had children. Those children had children. The number of people alive today because Curtis Cullen welded German beach obstacles to a Sherman tank in July 1944 is literally incalculable. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Family trees that exist because one sergeant refused to accept that hedgerows were an unsolvable problem. He never knew that legacy. He died thinking his contribution was a historical footnote. He worked a regular job at a spirits company, lived a quiet life in New York City, never sought recognition, never wrote memoirs, never gave interviews to historians. Just a sergeant from Cranford who saw a problem that was killing American soldiers and fixed it with whatever materials were available. The last surviving member of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron died in 2019 at age 97. His obituary mentioned serving alongside Curtis Cullen in Normandy. The veteran specifically remembered watching the first hedgerow breach during the demonstration. He said decades later that it was the moment he knew they would survive the bocage, the moment he understood they weren't going to die in those horrible hedge-lined fields. That's the real legacy. Not the medals, not the museum displays, not the doctrine manuals. The legacy is measured in lives saved. 1,500 men who didn't burn to death in Sherman tanks. 1,500 families who got their sons and husbands and fathers back home. And it started with a sergeant staring at a pile of German scrap steel on a Norman beach, imagining what those twisted beach obstacles could become if someone welded them to the front of American tanks. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we're rescuing forgotten stories from history every single week. Stories about sergeants and mechanics and ordinary soldiers who saved thousands of lives with scrap steel and improvised solutions. Real people who changed history. Real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Texas? Germany? France? Are you a tank crew veteran? A military historian? A descendant of someone who fought in Normandy? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive for future generations. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure Curtis Cullen doesn't disappear into silence and forgotten history. These men deserve to be remembered. You're helping make that happen.